First off, let's agree that some part of studying writing is called reading. But what we're really talking about here is learning to write. Indeed, there's something to be learned about writing by reading, but not so much. The fact of the matter is that those science guys with their nuclear magnetic resonating brain scanning imaging things have figured out that writing and talking come from the same part of the brain while reading happens in another part. By all means, read good authors and find one you like. Try to learn from their writing, but the best way to get better at writing is to write. Whoop-de-dang-do, this is some useful advice, isn't it? But after having helped a lot of students get through the writing portion of the GED exam, this is what it really comes down to. Write something, look at it, ask yourself what might confuse the reader and write it again. Then have somebody else read it and have them tell you what they found confusing, and write it again. Eventually you'll be able to read your own writing through someone else's eyes. It might help to set your writing aside for a day or a month or a year or more. Keep a journal. And read it yet again. If it confuses you and you wrote it, you know something about how well you wrote it in the first place. Your ability to figuratively take the reader by the hand and lead them down a logical path, tell them what they need to know when they need to know it, this is the beginning of good writing. And yes, it means lots of drafts, rough drafts, not so rough drafts, and final drafts. No getting around it, lots of throwing out this one and making that one a little better. So there is some part of the method of writing, the how of writing. But what is writing itself made of? Well, you gather some letters into these things called words. This is spelling, an important part of writing, but we'll come to spelling in due time in the flashcards. Then you gather some words into these sentence things. The rules how to do this, and it's called grammar. And we'll also come to this in due time in the flashcards. But what is important now is that sentences are said to be a complete thought. Okay, so you gather some of these sentences into paragraph things, and you have even more complete thoughts. Gather a bunch of paragraphs, and you have a chapter or a section, an even more complete thought. If this confuses you, you're not alone. This brings us to perhaps the most difficult part of writing, assembling thoughts into some kind of a logical order. It's all about taking your reading from the first sentence to the last. It's very important, and it isn't easy. All writers, good writers anyway, spend no little time figuring out how to do it. And here's a hint. I spent a lot of time writing and rewriting this writing on how you ought to organize your writing. So how do you put your thoughts, your sentences, paragraphs, or entire chapters in order to make for good writing? Well, it depends on what you are writing. If, for example, you're writing a dictionary, you simply put things in alphabetical order. Easy, but how often are you called upon to write a dictionary? Some things lend themselves to what's called chronological order. First this happened, and then that happened. Novels generally do this. Sometimes there are flashbacks or things like, meanwhile, back at the ranch. But such things must be done very carefully or the author sounds like a little kid relating an exciting movie with lots of, oh, I forgot. Before that, this happened. Biography and history lend themselves to chronological organization. Historic narratives must, from time to time, back up. Often it needs to back up and cross a border to explain what was going on somewhere else. For example, as the North is preparing for war, the new Confederacy in the South was, etc. Nothing wrong with this sort of writing. For that matter, nor is anything wrong with a reader having to work to keep track of things on his or her own. A little. It just can't be helped. Well, this is all pretty obvious, isn't it? You pick up a novel, biography, or dictionary to read, you don't think twice about how things are organized. But reading and writing are different, aren't they? As we get to nonfiction, it's about to get a little more complicated for the writer anyway. One fairly easy way to sort things out is on a continuum. If you don't like such a word, think progression. It's an ordered list of things based upon some rule. The least important to the most important, the smallest to the biggest, the cheapest to the most expensive. Again, it depends on your topic. And you can get pretty subjective, but if you spend a few words explaining how you determine the order you use, it can also be very effective. I need to remind you we're talking about nonfiction writing from here on. For some writing, a continuum might not work, but if we break the topic up into 2 or more sections and then label these sections, we end up with a topical organization. It's a little harder this way, but for some topics, it might be the best way to go. In fact, teachers and the GED people tend to give assignments or exams that all but require this sort of organization. While in some ways it's the most useful organizational technique, it's also the most difficult. Think of it as the art of nonfiction writing, or the art of scientific writing. It's also the key to getting good grades, passing exams, and impressing your boss for that matter. It might also be the key to making it easier to do the actual writing, at least in the long run. I have a lot to say about coming up with useful categories in writing, part 2. But let's review some universal categories, what I call some either-ors that might help you sort your thoughts before you begin writing. Let me stress, there is no single this or that that works for all topics. You need to pick the right one for your topic, and then what you want to say. Anything a human can perceive, can see, feel, hear, or smell will have both things that we can all agree upon and things we could argue about if we really wanted to. Or to be less confrontational, subjective attributes that strike us on a gut level. You aren't sure exactly why you feel the way you just do. For example, you could describe someone as tall and thin with light brown hair, the objective, and then describe them as being of kind heart and having a quirky sense of humor, the subjective. The art and science either-or is not far from the objective and subjective. Not for nothing are colleges and universities organized the way they are. A Bachelor of Arts means you aren't quite sure, but creative as it can be. A Bachelor of Science, on the other hand, means you better dang well know for sure and do it the right way. For example, if you're writing about a profession or process, you might sort your thoughts into the part of the profession that are art, the creative side, and the parts that are scientific, a little more nailed down. Eastern-Western works well for art, religion, philosophy, culture, law, economics, and such like. Broad, slippery topics like these need some dang good big boxes and some pretty good littler ones too. Just be sure to spend a few words on how and why you divide things up the way you do. Fail, and you'll find yourself writing around and around and around in circles. Believe me, anybody who's written more than a shopping list has done this at one time or another. Yep, there's religion again. Monotheism, mono means one and theism means God, and poly means many, and you get the drift. Polytheism is like the Roman gods of this and that, and monotheism is like the single God of Islam. No rule that says some topics can't fit into one or more either-or. Art, history, culture, etc. work well when you break them down into ancient or modern, and fashion might as well too. But you better be prepared to explain where or why ancient ends and modern begins. Foreign and domestic categories work for some things, particularly expensive things like paintings, wines, cars, etc. But note that any president will be graded on the success of both his foreign policy as well as his domestic policy. This is a three-part this or that. Think of it as a this, that, or the other. The animal, mineral, vegetable thing sounds like part of a kid's game of 20 questions, but I bring it up here for good reason. It's entirely possible that having a good this, that, or the other will open up your thinking. Let's take the topic of food. The animal-vegetable thing is obvious and perfectly beginning, but what about minerals? If you ponder this for a minute, you might remember that salt, iron, potassium, vitamins, etc., and remember to include them in your writing. And you might get an A instead of a B+ for having done so. I saved this universal for last. It's not really about the subject at hand, but rather how we feel about the subject, or about how society ought to feel about, use, support, not support the subject at hand. It's extremely subjective, but I can almost promise you that someone somewhere is going to ask you to write a pro/con paper. Let's review. Good writing involves editing. Lots of editing. Get used to it. Good writing starts with organizing things so your reader can follow along. But before you organize your things for your reader, it might help to organize your thoughts for your own dang self. Lots of ways to do this. Alphabetical, for example, or chronological. Novels are usually organized in chronological order. You can also nail down some sort of continuum, a progression from the littlest to the biggest, or earliest to latest, and so forth and so on. But this is actually chronological, isn't it? But when we move from creative writing, novels and stories, to nonfiction, informative or persuasive writing, we need some other way to organize things. It's a little tricky, but useful to divide topics into subtopics, what I call either-ors. There are some universal either-ors, for example, objective and subjective, arts and sciences, Eastern and Western, ancient and modern, and the list goes on. Sometimes two this or that's aren't enough, and you might need 3 subtopics of this, that, and the other. And by the way, if you have more than 3 subtopics, you better know exactly what you're doing. Here is a final important either-or, the pro-con. You are either for it or you're against it. Does a good job with controversial things like politics or philosophical issues. That's the good news. The bad news, and it's not really that bad at all, is the universal either-or may not get her done for the task at hand. You'll need to come up with your own specific subcategories. But I take this up in my next little slideshow. Let me know what you think, and thanks for watching.